All right, good afternoon again, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It is our second webinar in the 2020 MSHA webinar series, and today we'll be discussing preparing for and managing MSHA inspections. So I just want to take a quick minute to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you're all staying safe during our current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic going on. So I appreciate that you can take some time today and discuss just getting ready for what is going to be probably the busy season with MSHA inspections coming up, because despite what is currently going on around the world, the agency is still going to be out conducting inspections. And for the most of you, the mining industry is largely going to be considered an essential business service as a support to the construction industry and other essential businesses. So you will have the ability to keep running if that's what your companies continue to do. And with continuing to operate, we get the joy of having MSHA on-site. So we're going to take some time and just do a quick rundown of some strategies for best handling when MSHA is on-site and getting ready for them to arrive. As we typically do, we are recording today's webinar. You will be provided a copy of the recording and the slides following the webinar today. That will be sent out by email. There's also a chat function that you can submit questions to if you're on the online portal for the meeting today. And again, if there's any questions that anyone has that they want to reach out to me directly for, that is absolutely fine. I welcome you to do so. We have muted all the phone lines because we are recording it, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So, as you may know, if you've joined us before, my name is Nick Scala. I am the chair of the MSHA practice group here at Con Carey, and I will be your host today to discuss preparing for and managing MSHA inspections. Just a bit about the firm. We work with companies all over the country in both MSHA and OSHA workplace safety capacity, helping them to manage inspections, prepare for inspections, as we're going to talk about today, but also handling litigation and any other types of interaction that the agencies might have, whether it's investigations into accidents or injuries or fatalities, or agents of management or discrimination claims, or whistleblower claims, anything along those lines. We're here to assist you with that. As I talked about, we're going to go through a breakdown of several topics. So first, preparing for MSHA to arrive and how are we going to get ready to accompany them. We're going to go over some resources that are beneficial to review regularly for your operation, but especially in preparation for MSHA coming on site, and most certainly for those individuals who might be tasked with accompanying the MSHA inspector when they get to your facility. We're also going to take a bit of time and talk about what is advance notice and how can we best work with MSHA, along with the opportunity to contest citations. And we're going to focus mainly on those opportunities to contest citations while MSHA is on site, but we will touch briefly on the different avenues that you can contest citations after issuance takes place. So, to just get kicked off, we obviously have the ability to accompany MSHA when they come on site for our inspection. That is our company's right. We'll talk about specifically where that right is derived from in the Mine Act a bit later, but in order to fully exercise this right and take advantage of our ability to accompany MSHA, we want to be prepared for their arrival. And I know that seems, quite basic, right? Oh, of course, we're going to be ready for MSHA to arrive. But there are specific things that we can do to make sure that when MSHA shows up, we're prepared for them to be there. We're prepared to accompany them during the inspection. And some of the most basic elements that, unfortunately, sometimes seem to evade companies is having a firm representative on site, prepared and trained. And preferably, you would have multiple people on site, prepared and trained to accompany MSHA, and multiple persons per shift if you are an around-the-clock operation or run multiple shifts. And that is just so when MSHA gets on site, there's no question of who is going to be there. We have a call tree in place about how these individuals are going to be contacted and who is going to contact them. before the inspection takes place. These individuals, in terms of training, should be prepared to take notes and photographs similar to what MSHA is doing, so that when we get through the inspection, the only party with a record of what was going on is not the agency, but that we also have ours, so that we can review it both for internal processes, but also so we can review it to see, do we disagree with the citation? And, based off of our recollection of events, the inspector's notes or descriptions of a citation are inaccurate. Those are just, we're going to talk about each one of these in greater detail throughout, but this is just a very basic kind of must-haves when we're preparing our action plan for when MSHA gets there. The biggest thing is we want to have who are those people, and we want them to be contacted in a quick manner, in a reasonably concise manner, meaning we don't want to have a broadcast around. That is a great way to bring about some of those concerns with advance notice. So these are just kind of some quick hits that are going to carry over as themes throughout our discussion today. Before MSHA arrives, though, what can we do? And, much of this is to kind of know ourselves and also know who's going to be coming on site. We want to look at some of the same materials that MSHA will look at and the inspectors are reviewing. And that's not just so that we know what they're going to be looking at when they come out, but that we can proactively address the same concerns or the same areas at our mind. So one of the best things that we can do is can review our history, right? MSHA has, if we don't keep our own data on citations issued, has a mine data retrieval system is what it's called, and it's on their website. And I hope that you're all familiar with it because it is a great tool, but it tells you what inspections have taken place, when they took place, what citations were issued. We can review this to see if there's trends in what we were being issued, if there have been a particular type of citation, be it electrical or otherwise, that we've been received quite a bit. Also, the inspectors are going to look at this enforcement history before they come out to the mine. They will look at a 2-year look back typically about every citation that was issued. So that is something that we can also do to prepare ourselves for what the focus of the inspection might be, but also so that we can take a look before MSHA gets out there, or maybe really just do some self-searching about where can we improve our safety and health programs. We also want to look at the MSHA website for any initiatives. Right now they have 3 initiatives going on. Powered haulage safety, which is a 3-part initiative on conveyor belt safety, as well as mobile equipment safety and seat belts. Those are going to be areas of emphasis when MSHA gets out to your mine, as well as contractor safety and electrical safety. If you are keeping up on what's going on the MSHA website, this is a great way to see where the areas of focus might be for the inspectors when they come out. You can also, on that website, and I recommend you do this, sign up or subscribe to their email blast so that you will get emails from the agency about different events that are going on or initiatives that are happening, or if there is a fatalogram or a best practices sheet that goes out that might directly apply to your operation. Next, we want to be familiar with, and again, this seems straightforward, but our internal policies and procedures. And we also want to know what MSHA's policies and procedures are going to be. So, if we do have that opportunity to take some time and review what does MSHA's General Inspection Procedures Handbook look like? What are they going to be doing? And a lot of that material is what makes up this presentation today, but MSHA has a lot of handbooks on a lot of different topics, and they are a helpful place to go and read if you're having trouble sleeping, but also if you want to get into the mindset of your inspector and your enforcement body. For our own internal purposes, we want to know our policies and procedures so we can enforce them, and also so that we're prepared to discuss, why a condition or a practice is not hazardous, and the inspector might be mistaken in their assuming that it is. Lastly, we want to be able to check MSHA standards. This is pretty straightforward. 30 CFR, 30 Code of the Federal Regulations is the part that applies to the mine sites. That is where we're going to have parts 46 and 48 for training purposes. That's where we're going to have Part 62, which applies to hearing conservation programs, and also the regulations. For metal, non-metal, they're going to be Part 56 for surface operations and Part 57 for underground operations on the metal, non-metal side. Coal is going to be Parts 75 and 77. But for most of the companies I think that are on this today, we're going to be looking at probably that metal, non-metal side. So just know that is where you're going to find the standards. That's where you're going to find the specifics as to what you're being cited for or what you might be cited for failing to comply with. It's going to go back to those MSHA standards in that 30 CFR. So we should be prepared to look at that, whether we do it, electronically by downloading it to our phone or pulling it up through the internet, or if we have one of the little miniature green books or another book of the regulations. We just want to be able to check what the inspectors are saying, because, I guarantee that every one of them does not have that entire CFR memorized. So many times you might know it better than them. When we're talking about preparing and using the mine data retrieval system, I wanted to take a couple minutes because there's been some changes with the data retrieval system in the last few years. For an extended period of time, over a decade or more, MSHA had the same mine data retrieval system. And it had its flaws, but it worked pretty well and everyone was quite used to it. A little over a year ago, MSHA introduced a new mine data retrieval system. And probably about 6 months ago, they withdrew the legacy system and made that new system the only system that you could use. It is, or it was, I should say, flawed in many ways. The ideas and some of the ways that they were going to lay out the information and the information that you could gather is very helpful, and I agree with that. But the functionality of this site left a lot to be desired. MSHA did hear industry's complaints on that, and they have been working to put out a new version of the mine data retrieval system. And I actually just noticed that this got put out yesterday. So the new mine data retrieval system, this is the first page that you're going to get when you go to it. It looks different than the most recent version, and again, different from the legacy version, but this is their 3.0, I guess what they're calling it. So take some time. It's a bit more user-friendly. It's a bit more navigatable right now than the previous version from the little that I've had time to dig through it. But this is a great tool. You can search by your mine, by your contractor. You can see what other companies in the areas around you, whether if you're searching by state and county and what is mined there. If you're a larger operation, you can search by the controlling company or the operator and see what other mines in your company are getting. But it's a very good tool. Some of the information that you can get when you search an operation is, a list of these come up as links. And, here, what I would typically tell people to look at is take a look at the second one down. It's going to be your inspections. And it will show you the dates of MSHA inspections and when they're taking place. This is a very helpful tool. If for nothing else, getting an idea when the agency might be showing up, because there are patterns. Each field office is going to have a certain number of mines to inspect, and they're going to have a rotation on those mines for their inspectors. So you might see, not to the date, but you might see a pattern that you're going to be inspected typically, once in November or December and once in March or May, or May or April. Something along those lines, that you can somehow get, a feeling of when those inspections might take place. That might be affected, especially if you're one of the operations that's currently going through the blur. So maybe you now have a new field office or you have a new district that's overseeing. I don't think that inspection kind of time frame is going to be changed or impacted anyway by the creation of MSHA's new 3 regions. If you've heard about that, they're creating 3 regions throughout the country: Western, Eastern, and Central. Pretty basic. And those are going to be kind of another level of management between national, then these regions, and then all the districts are going to operate below them still. But nonetheless, I don't think that's going to impact your inspections too much, but the changing of field offices or changing of the districts might impact that timing some. That's only, though, going to affect a small number of mines around the country. As I talked about, you can look at your violations or even your health samples and see maybe where there's trends of alleged noncompliance with the agency, or maybe just issuances of citations, whether they're going to be S&S or not. Like I said, you can determine, do you have a problem with berming the last couple of inspections, or do you have a problem with electrical safety in the eyes of MSHA? You can look at that and somewhat maybe take a closer look at those areas, or review it with your employees and say, hey, we need to increase what we're doing, or we need to make sure we're following our internal procedures on this. Lastly, the POV monitoring tool probably doesn't apply to many. The S&S calculator is just a comparison that's going to say what is your rate of S&S citations issued per inspection day as compared to similar operations to yours around the country. That was getting a lot more traction and a lot more focus in the last administration when it got rolled out. The S&S calculator hasn't been as much of a focus of targeting inspections as it was previously, or at least MSHA isn't discussing it as much. Much like how rules to live by have somewhat gone away as an emphasis or an area of focus for the agency. But the second one up from the bottom, the VPID, this is what is going to be a summary of your history of citations, and that's going to be both violations per inspection day, meaning how many citations total are we getting per inspection day with MSHA, and also they will summarize your repeat violations per inspection day. So are you receiving numerous citations of the same standard? These are important because both of these, VPID and RPID, can be ways that our penalties increase significantly for what would typically be, maybe a smaller penalty citation. We can get these citations that are maybe the same standard, and that will increase our RPID if we're getting 6 or more of the same standard in a 15-month period. And that will increase our penalty by adding additional penalty points to our calculation. Similarly, if we're just getting a lot of citations, but maybe they aren't of the same standard, that can still increase our penalty points by increasing how many violations we get on a day. And a lot of times when people see big penalties for maybe what seems like a normal or an innocuous citation, they say, how is this happening? It is these history points. So you want to make sure that you're looking there and trying to manage, obviously how many citations we're getting, but if we're getting a lot of citations under a specific standard. That VPID tool is a good way to do trending in that region without having to look through all of the violations and try to make sense of that, especially if we're a very large operation, or that gets a significant number of citations per visit, and maybe if we're underground, we're getting 4 visits a year at minimum from MSHA. So something to keep in mind, some tools to help you prepare for when MSHA gets out there. We talked about some of these earlier, but we want to have the multiple persons trained to accompany the inspector, and that's just because what happens if someone's on vacation, or someone's out, or maybe someone is at home sick for the day, which is very possible right now, or any of those types of occurrences. We want to be prepared to have a replacement to step in and walk with MSHA around the facility. That is our right. I recommend that you do not let MSHA walk around unattended around your facility, both for their safety, the safety of others, and that we then just won't know what they're looking at, what they're seeing when they're out there. We also want to be prepared to take our own notes and even photos relevant to the citations and possibly any areas that might be contested later on. Now, I will say that if you are just taking your own notes, they are not going to be privileged. Your photos will not be privileged, meaning that at a later date and time, MSHA through discovery could request for those documents, and we would have to provide them. Now, does that mean that you have to give your notes and photos to the inspector at the time of the investigation or the inspection? Absolutely not. But MSHA can get them at a later date and time. So we want to be careful. What are we putting in our notes? We want to keep it fact specific. We want to keep away from making assumptions or, making declaratory statements on something that might be an unknown. We don't want to, we wanted them to be helpful. We don't want to paint with too much of rose-colored viewpoints, but we also want to put this in, a position or a recollection of events that might not be recorded by MSHA, because we don't want them to be the only ones with notes of what happened at that point in time. And those notes paint the company, or maybe actions of some individuals of the company, in a very unfavorable light. So we want to have our own notes. Now, if you are involved in an accident or a serious injury or a fatality investigation or even an agent management investigation, and you engage with counsel, typically this applies mostly to outside counsel. I can request you to take notes until I get on site or for me, and those can be privileged, or at least we can claim privilege on them as attorney work product and attorney-client communication, but that still won't apply to photos. Photos are not something that are able to be privileged very easily, if at all. So again, be careful if you're taking photos. I encourage you to take photos of anything the inspector does, maybe from a different viewpoint. I had a client one time who I thought had a good description of what sometimes inspectors do, and he called it the big fish photo, right? And especially with guarding, they see, maybe a hole in a guard, and the inspector goes up and takes a photo, directly next to the hole. And this, makes it look huge and gaping, and someone's arm could fall through it. And then we see another photo, and hopefully this is what we're getting from the company, and it's a few feet back, and it shows that the hole is just a couple inches by a couple inches. Definitely changes what the impression of the hazard is. But we want to be careful not to take angles that maybe include greater hazards or, greater areas of noncompliance. Maybe there's someone standing above this area without fall protection, hopefully not, but we definitely don't want that to be captured in an image that will or could be turned over to MSHA at some point in time. We also want to be careful not to recreate hazardous conditions for photos. It's uncommon, but particularly I was talking with one company once, and they were telling me about how they got cited for a specific occurrence with MSHA that the inspector observed, and so they recreated it after the fact when trying to challenge the citation, and put their people in the exact same positions doing the exact same tasks, and their intent was to say, hey, this is not hazardous, look at it from this point of view. And MSHA asked them, when was that photo taken? And they told them that it was recreated at a different point in time. And they issued an additional citation for recreating the hazardous event. So again, that's an outlier. That's a pretty strange occurrence, but still just shows you have to be careful with photos, because they can be our greatest ally, an asset in the litigation, as well as something can cut on us. So be careful in that regard. We also want to be prepared for MSHA. Again, we talked about this a bit, but just reviewing their materials. So are there fatalograms, are there hazards alerts for trends or initiatives that apply? If so, we want to review that. Not that long ago, a year or two, or several years ago, MSHA said that if there is a fatalogram that was put out that is directly relevant to your operation, and a similar accident occurs on your site, they will say that you were put on notice that this condition or this incident was possible based on their publication of that fatalogram or hazard alert. So, we want to be careful to, when we see these, and again, this is another reason why we want to subscribe to MSHA's mailings, if we see something like that come out and it directly applies, maybe it has to do with a hopper injury or a conveyor belt injury, which is going to be widely applicable, or maybe it's something more specific like dredging. If our operation has any of those elements, we want to take a moment to review it ourselves, see if it does directly apply to our workforce, and then if it does, review it with them and maybe make it the topic of a safety stand down or a morning safety meeting or a toolbox talk. Just what are some of our internal policies on that? How can we keep the similar incident from happening here? And just remind everyone to keep being safe. But MSHA has said that if similar incidents occur, the second incident or the third incident, they're going to consider that the employer was put on notice of that hazard being a possible or potential hazard, and that if they did nothing to, do that reminder, train people on it, that can reflect poorly upon the assignment of negligence from MSHA and any subsequent citations. We also want to know our record-keeping requirements, and these are some of just the most basic ones, but these are also going to be probably some of the records that are going to be requested every time that MSHA is on site. So, workplace exams, obviously those are always going to be required to be maintained for 1 year. They're also going to be requested by MSHA when they get on site. Beware of all the changes that have been happening with metal non-metal workplace exam rule, in that now, we're back to this 2017 version of the rule where the workplace exam must be done before miners begin work in an area. You no longer have that or as clause to kind of do it as people enter an area. And also, every adverse condition observed during that inspection must be listed on the report along with the corrected date. Before, if you promptly corrected an adverse condition observed during the inspection, meaning you corrected it before any miners were exposed to it, you did not have to document it. That kind of exemption is no longer valid given the current state of the workplace exam rule. So the example that I typically give for that, it's very basic, but you were doing a workplace exam, you're walking down a catwalk and you see a hose piled up in the middle of a catwalk. That's obviously has the potential to be a tripping hazard. In the previous version of the workplace exam rule that we were following for most of 2019 and the end of 2018, you could have just picked up that hose, maybe hung it right next to where it was lying and in its designated spot, and you could have just gone about your business. You didn't have to write that down. Now you have to record that there was a tripping hazard, that there was a hose lying in a catwalk, and that you corrected it, and the date that you corrected it. So a bit more of a documentation burden on that. I have heard not a lot of citations being issued on the workplace exam rule, but some of them that have been are coming back to those new elements. So you're not putting every condition that was observed on the workplace exam rule. And, the only reason we're going to get to that, only way we're going to get to that is through someone admitting that they're not doing it or someone informing MSHA of that. On the pre-shift inspections, this is from mobile equipment. Just remember that we need to, provide these documents to MSHA, but we only need to provide or maintain records of work or pre-shift examinations on mobile equipment if there is a defect found, and then only until that defect is corrected. Now, I think it's a best practice to have everyone who operates a piece of mobile equipment do their inspection and maintain that paper or that form throughout the shift, so that if MSHA shows up, they can show them that, hey, we did it. Or if you're just going to check it yourself as a company internally. But be sure to watch what your internal record-keeping policies are and make sure that you're documenting that, we looked at anything listed on a pre-shift inspection, we either corrected it or we determined it not to be broken or a hazard. And also that we are keeping those records, whatever our corporate determination is for how long we need to keep pre-shift inspections. Know that MSHA's requirement is rather minimal. So, only have to be maintained if a defect is found, and then until that defect is corrected. We can also, look at, in terms of the site-specific and task training, those are going to be always asked for. Site-specific, especially right now with contractors, they're going to be looking for that as part of the contractor initiative. Task training, we want to look at what are we doing there and how are people getting their task training. Is it adequate? That's a question that's going to come up with MSHA. Do these people all have task training for what they're doing? Unfortunately, a lot of times, deficiencies in task training or completion of workplace exams don't really get discovered by MSHA, or at least perceived deficiencies, until there's an incident or an accident of some type and there's a really deep dive on them, and then they might determine that they're not adequate. But we want to make sure that we're up to date on all those. We know that our task training and our new minor records and our annual refresher are always going to look at. And that's something that we want to be prepared and just have ready for when they come. We want to know where they are. We want to know who's maintaining them. We want to know what is our deadline for providing them. For example, for minor training records, we need to provide them to MSHA by the end of the shift that MSHA requests them, or else the agency has the ability to start issuing 103G orders, or I'm sorry, 104G orders to withdraw those minors because they don't have proof of training. And for a training plan, we have until the next day. So we got to be prepared, especially if we're a contractor and we have many people on many sites, to get those records out quickly. So again, kind of just a summary, we want our company reps when they're prepared, right? We've talked about what they need. We want them to have similar tools to the inspector when they're coming out. So camera, notepad, if we think a tape measure is necessary, things like that to, go through and collect similar data. It's important to note that if you are the representative of the company and that you are looking or walking with MSHA, that often you are going to be considered an agent of management, most likely. In most cases, you will be. And also, your comments are going to be binding for the company, most likely as well. And what that means? It means whatever you say, MSHA is going to apply that as being the company admitting to it or claiming that. So you need to be careful in what you're saying. We want to be measured. I'm not telling you to not say anything, but also you just got to be cognizant that, maybe a witty remark or a joke is not taken with the right context by the agency, by the inspector, and all of a sudden that's in the notes. And the company's stuck dealing with maybe the ramifications of that. Maybe that means they've increased the negligence or maybe the severity of a citation. So, we want to be very careful. And that's not even really getting into more of the liability standpoints in terms of unwarrantable failures and where that can go. But, that is also part of it. If we're looking at a 104D or a high negligence 104A even, things that can lead to agent liability investigations, those are most commonly, the vast majority, based upon statements by the individuals who were with MSHA during the inspection. So we want to be clear that, and just know that if we are that person, if we are going through the inspection with the agency, we are really just cognizant of what we're saying and knowing that MSHA is sitting there taking notes. And if you've never read the notes from an inspection, I encourage you to do it. Maybe you're contesting a citation and you can get the notes in discovery if you're doing it yourself, or if you're doing it with outside counsel such as myself. Just ask for a copy of the notes, or even if you're not contesting a citation, you can submit, what is called a Freedom of Information Act request for a copy of the inspection file. And it can be an eye-opening experience to read what is actually recorded during these inspections. And I think for especially people that are beginning to accompany MSHA, it's a good opportunity, maybe on one of their first few inspections, to get them the notes in some capacity and let them read through it and see what maybe they said or they allegedly said and what was captured in the notes. If you have any questions about how to do that, reach out to me. I can help you file a Freedom of Information Act and get notes if that's something that you're interested in doing. So let's look a bit at, how can we avoid citations? And we've talked about a bit of this already with our review of the MSHA website as well as our mine history. But another area is just ensure that if we have company policies, and I hope that we do all have company safety and health policies, that our employees are made aware of them and that they are following them. Also, periodic audits of employee compliance are incredibly important, as well as, enforcement on the workforce of non-compliance. And that has to be equal. So no one's getting a free skate just because they're your favorite employee. This is just important. So in the world of OSHA, you have this affirmative defense, which is called unforeseeable or unpreventable employee misconduct. And what that means is, we had a policy in place. We trained our employees to follow that policy. We enforced our policies in the workplace. And if you didn't follow one, you were disciplined in some way. And we did that consistently and evenly across the board. Now, despite all of those efforts, employee X went and did the opposite of what we told them to do. Now, in the world of OSHA, that is, often a way where a citation is defeated. It will be vacated or it won't be issued because they don't have the ability to do so. But in MSHA is a strict liability regulation, so they can still issue that citation to you regardless. However, having that information out there is a good way to lower severity, is a good way to lower negligence, and being able to provide that information to MSHA. If we're doing compliance audits, and this is more so of just going out and observing and making sure people are following our work, but a lot of companies like to do these audits where they have, people actually write an audit form. I saw this thing that looked unsafe, or this is a violation. I want to say that I think is a good tool. You need to be very careful though, because those records, those audits are very unlikely, because they're a company document, to not be privileged, and therefore could be discoverable by MSHA. And MSHA has really kind of wide-ranging document request authority, which is a discussion for another webinar we've talked about before, but it is hard in the inspection process, if there's a document that the agency really feels is going to prove its case, especially if it's having to do with employer knowledge of a hazard that wasn't corrected or was not addressed quickly enough or aggressively enough, they will press pretty hard. And they don't have subpoena power to require documents, but they have the power to shut down your operation if they're not getting what you want. So these audits where people have their employees maybe check for hazards, or they have another group of employees from a different operation come to one of their other operations and do it, those are great tools. And I applaud the effort to get these fresh eyes and fresh perspectives into the workplace, but we need to be careful what's going on in those documents. We need to be very quick to look at everything on there, everything listed, and document whether or not it was corrected, when it was corrected. If it wasn't corrected, why was it not corrected? Maybe it's because we determined that it wasn't a hazard, that it wasn't a potential violation, that there was not a risk to the workforce because of it. But we want to be sure that those are well papered, just like we want to do on our workplace exams with our date of corrective action, and our pre-shift exams with making note of what was done to investigate or correct something listed, because we don't want to have these audits out there with a bunch of recommendations that aren't being acted upon. That's a good way to get into hot water with the agency. So another area that we want to talk about quickly, but it's advance notice. And the reason I want to talk about advance notice is because we probably all heard MSHA or an inspector say those words at some point in time, either that they couldn't tell you when they were going to return to check the illumination in the evening, or because you asked them when are they going to come back to do something when they're halfway through an inspection and it ends on a Thursday afternoon. And they say, well, I can't tell you because that would be advance notice. The idea of advance notice is that you don't know when MSHA is coming on site, because they don't want you doing a fire drill to correct everything that is out of compliance. Now, that's not going to be the case at 99.9% of operations, but that is the intent for the 0.01% of companies that are doing it. And there's, you've heard stories probably about the older back in the day at big underground coal mines where they had codes that MSHA was on site so that they would start covering things up. And really, advance notice was meant to prevent those kinds of instances. But we also hear it a lot when, inspectors are saying, oh, well, I can't tell you at the front gate because that'd be advance notice. That's not what it means. What it means is it prohibits giving advance notice of inspections conducted by MSHA. It's meaning calling up someone and telling them, hey, I saw MSHA, driving up the road and they're going to be there soon. That's really the idea of it. And we want to avoid those. But this is also why we need to be prepared for when MSHA comes on site and have that call tree in place, because, it does mean we want to avoid broadcasting an inspector's presence at the mine, or, that they need to go to an area of the mine. Those are actually a couple cases recently where it was found that advance notice was given. And in those cases, it was pretty harmless, or at least in the mind of the individuals doing it, it was harmless. But, in one case, an inspector came out to a facility and said, I need to do an inspection of this area of the mine, and asked someone in the control room, to get him someone up to there to walk with the inspector. So the miner in the control room got on the radio and just broadcast to everyone in the area, MSHA's up here, need someone to walk with him, someone come on up. So they went and did their inspection, and when it ended, the inspector also gave them a citation for advance notice because they broadcast it to the entire area. So we want to be sure to tailor our notifications to the specific person or persons that we've designated to accompany MSHA. Whether that is just our company representative, or if we're an operation that also has a miner's rep, getting both of them present. It doesn't mean that inspectors can just blow past our checkpoints or a scale house to really get in and do an inspection without anyone else around. It doesn't mean that the inspectors can refuse to identify themselves, but it is something that we need to balance. And one of the reasons that we want to have that call tree ready, and that we're making sure we're using a phone instead of broadcasting things on a radio network, just because those are actually instances recently that have resulted in citations under advance notice. Now, it is something that has a lot of teeth to it if MSHA wants to pursue that, even up to criminal penalties. But that's not typically how it goes unless you have a situation where maybe there is a lot of covering up of violations or volatile conditions. And it's a pretty sophisticated network to, try and hide those from the agency. But nonetheless, we hear that term a lot. I just want everyone to be comfortable with what it is and what they can and cannot do. And we'll talk about this a bit later, but if you do have an inspector who's being a bit obtuse with regard to advance notice, that's something that you need to take up the chain to talk to their field office supervisor, even the district level, to really, flesh out what they can and cannot do. But it's something to be aware of and not to be afraid of as much if we're not doing anything wrong, but just to know so that you can push back if it's ever threatened against you or your employees. Additionally, we've talked about what can happen in terms of when MSHA comes on site. It is very much, a high-level overview, but this is typically what your inspections are going to have, and that they, are outlined to have in the inspection handbooks. Now, I should say that there was a general inspection handbook that was just redone, combining the coal and metal inspection handbooks, and they no longer have something, opening conferences listed. I don't think that's going to change the fact that you can get one if you want one, and that you should try to have one with MSHA, because it's an opportunity just to sit down and review maybe what's changed at the mine site, what hasn't changed, what areas are in operation, what areas are closed down, things like that. But you're going to have this opening conference, we should request it, as the inspection is self-explanatory. Then you're going to have a combination of either review of citations on a daily basis, or maybe at the end of the inspection during the closing conference, and a review of the company contest rates. Now, one thing to know at the beginning is we want to make sure that we're coordinating with contractors. And as a contractor, we want to make sure that we communicate with our production operator if we want to be present for any inspection that's going on. And also as a contractor, if we're a company that's going to have individuals at many mines, we probably want to make sure that those individuals are up to speed on some of these topics that we're discussing today, so they're prepared to interact with an MSHA inspector without maybe a manager or safety manager present. But, we want to make sure that when we go through this, we are, prepared to say that these are areas that we want to discuss. These are areas that we're going to be looking at. MSHA is especially going to be looking at the contractor side, as I mentioned, given their new initiative. So they're going to want to know where the contractors are, how many are on site, and that is likely going to be where they go at the very beginning of inspections at these times. And they're really going to be looking closely at, do they have all their training? if they qualify as minors, do they have their site-specific training? So areas to keep a close eye on. We've talked about the company's options as well as minors' representative right to accompany MSHA when they're on site. That applies to the entire inspection, opening conference, closing conference, and inspection, and anything else that happens. You're allowed to have, your company rep present for those. And then also, if your company does have a minors representative, they are supposed to be at those as well, if they choose to be. Now, those are areas that are always going to happen. You also, need to know that MSHA can't require anyone to let them walk alone through the operation. That's not permitted. They can't, we talked about with advance notice, they can't force anyone to come on site. But when we're contacting whoever is going to accompany the inspector, again, we want to be very specific in how we are contacting those individuals, because there's limits to how long MSHA has to wait. And there isn't a specific limit, which probably shouldn't surprise anyone, but it is MSHA must wait and give operators a reasonable amount of time to get their representative or a minors representative up to accompany them during the inspection. Now, what is reasonable, I think, depends on the inspector, depends on, their relationship with the operation, their relationship with the people that they're waiting to come up and accompany them, as well as, probably just how their day is going at that point in time. I recommend that we have all of our documents, like we've discussed, available. So if there's ever a point in time and we have those kind of set up in a specific area, that we aren't going to have maybe our production operators rep present for an hour or an hour and a half because they're driving in from somewhere else. Maybe we can offer to the inspector, hey, instead of going out into the plant, why don't you check through our training records, and, our production rep will be here in an hour and a half. That's sometimes a way to increase your reasonable amount of time that the inspectors will wait. Additionally, we want to make sure that everyone, all of our minors, but especially those minors that are accompanying the agency, are aware of their minors' rights, because regardless of your member of management or not, you're still a minor and the rights apply. Now, I will say that, what we're going to talk about right now, really these apply and are most relevant during accident or injury investigations or agent of management investigations or whistleblower investigations, where there's actually going to be formal interviews. And I'm not trying to recommend that, we give MSHA the cold shoulder when an inspector's on site and just wants to talk to someone about, did you do your pre-op on this piece of equipment today? We can't do that. That won't help our rapport with the agency, and it won't help our inspections go smoother. But if we are in the situation where, maybe we had a 104D issued by the inspector, something they believe was an unwarrantable failure, and a 104D, observed, or we have a high negligence citation and they say they want to sit down and talk with, the manager, maybe the person accompanying them, we're then tiptoeing into the interview area. And especially in these situations, there can be liability for agents of management personally, as well as the company. So we want to make sure that everyone knows their rights. And that is, any minor at any time can speak with MSHA, by MSHA's request or the minor's initiation. Anyone can decline to sit down and do an interview with MSHA or its investigators and inspectors. And if you're doing an interview with MSHA, you can have any person of your choosing present with you if you decide to go through with it. And again, I don't want to belabor this, because I think this rights are more pertinent to formal interviews during investigations into greater liability than a normal inspection. But nonetheless, sometimes inspections can evolve, especially with the issuance of more severe citations and orders. So just kind of building on what we just discussed in the minors' rights, MSHA cannot require minors to speak with them or participate in the interview. They can't require anyone to speak with them alone, can't require anyone to write or sign a written statement, and they cannot, threaten or coerce anyone to cooperate with them. And that applies, again, to everyone, whether you're an agent, whether you're accompanying them or whether it's a rank and file minor, these all apply. So, again, we want to be clear though, and we want to be aware that mine operator representatives can be considered agents of management. And again, that's one of the reasons we want to be clear what we're saying to the agency, because it can be recorded, and that we will likely be bound by these in terms of negligence designations, but also just admissions by the company and by the individual. And typically, again, when we're going through these agent investigations or we're going through 104Ds or elevated enforcement actions, they most commonly, in my experience, come back to some admission by a member of management or by the person who was accompanying MSHA when they were on site. So just be aware of that and make sure that we're being careful as we go through that, especially if we're getting into the area where we're having enforcement actions or more severe enforcement actions. I'd even go as far as to say, and I know this might not be possible or practical at every operation, but again, this is why we want to have multiple people trained and prepared to accompany MSHA. But if we are at a situation where we have a 104D, so an unwarrantable failure order issued to the company, that is always going to be issued to and served to an individual member of the company, member of management. To the extent it's possible, I'd recommend the person named in that order, sit out the rest of the inspection, just because anything that is said from that point forward can continue to be put in the notes as building the foundation for why that was a reasonable issuance. And again, I know that is not always the case. That's not always possible, especially at smaller operations where maybe we only have a small crew on site. But, in that case, if we have heightened enforcement actions coming down, we want to be clear that, what we say is going to be put in the notes. So we want to be careful about what we're saying. While MSHA is on site, don't be afraid to ask questions. We want to have some good dialogue with the inspector. It also sometimes can help to have good questions going back and forth and good discussion. Shows that you're committed to the safety and health of the mine, while also not adverse to working with MSHA to pursue that. I think that's important, kind of the tenor. You're allowed to have disagreements too. You're allowed to ask them, why is this a violation, or why do they think that is S&S? Now, I would say be careful to answer that yourself. And give some admission that a citation is valid, or give some admission that you think it's S&S. But you can ask that question to the inspectors, especially if you're taking notes. It's a good way to figure out what's their headspace at. I just want to say though, try to avoid arguments. Far too often you hear about individuals who say that everything was going fine until they got in an argument, a citation, and then the inspection and the whole tenor of it took a turn for the worse. Additionally, when can we contest citations? There's a lot of options. This is kind of the overview of what is all your opportunities to contest citations. Obviously, you can do it at the time it's issued, at closeout conferences. You have the option to apply for an informal contest, which is your 10-day conference, sometime called that. These are granted at MSHA's discretion. I think that they can be beneficial, but only if you want very specific changes. If you're saying, I want 5 citations thrown out, I don't think an informal is probably going to get you where you need to go. You're probably looking at a formal contest. But if you have 1 or 2 citations where you say, I disagree with the negligence on this, or I disagree with the S&S on this, or, 1 citation in particular, or 2 citations where you say, I have a really, a big issue with why this was even issued, this needs to be vacated, this is a complete departure from, how anything has been enforced in the past, that's an opportunity to go in there and maybe ask to vacate and have some discussion. Otherwise, I think informal contests, the system is overloaded, so they sometimes take a lot longer than they initially, I think MSHA had planned, but you still have to get that request in within 10 days of the issuance of the citation. But formal contest is sometimes going to be the best option for that. And that's, again, going to be triggered once you have the proposed assessment received in the mail. So you're getting that penalty from MSHA. There's a couple other unique situations where you need to file contest with the commission within 30 days of issuance, and that's going to be for 107As or 104Bs or any other type of order that might have a penalty with it. If you're getting anything like that, you have a question about how that might work, reach out to me and I'm happy to discuss it with you. So why are we contesting? Obviously, we know these answers. We either disagree with how it was issued in its entirety or the accuracy of some of the descriptions in it. Are there issues with the penalty assessed or the abatement required? Now, I will say that is a good time to bring it up and raise the flag prior to any of the formal contests, maybe immediately after issuance if we have abatement concerns, and that's because we are required to abate things promptly with MSHA, and many times abatement takes place before MSHA even leaves or the inspection's over. And if it doesn't, they're going to come back to determine abatement. So if we have concerns with abatement, we want to have a very open discussion with the inspector and even up through MSHA management about that. If you want to disagree with the designations of SNS or negligence, those are other reasons to contest. For contractors, pre-qualification is a big one. Just because you're looking at protecting that record so that you can maybe bid on other jobs and things that are going on there. Excuse me. The best times during the inspection, and I'm just focusing there, I would say the best time to order or to challenge a citation is when it's being written, right? Or when it's being discussed before it's even put to paper. It's kind of like what happens when you get a speeding ticket. You get pulled over and you make your arguments to the police officer, and if you don't get them to give you a warning before they head back and write your ticket, you're going to get the ticket. Similar to MSHA, you can make the arguments at the closeout conference, and it's a good time to note your objection for the record. But at that point, the inspector's already written up. He's probably run that citation packet past the field office supervisor, and you're not likely to get a lot of movement at that point in time. So it's almost better just to save the note that you disagree with it, that you're going to contest it to the inspector, and then, prepare for your informal contest or your formal contest. The last kind of area that we want to discuss today is just communicating with MSHA, and specifically communicating with management in the case that you maybe are having a disagreement with an inspector, or you believe that inspectors are abusing their discretion with, threats of advance notice, or that they are just really going off the reservation with respect to what they're citing when they come on site. You got to be respectful not to break the chain of command when you're having those disagreements, though, just because MSHA is it's a big bureaucracy, right? It's a big organization, just like any of ours. We don't want someone calling the boss's boss to complain about us, and then we're getting chewed out from several areas. Inspectors are the same way. Also, just remember that you're probably going to have that inspector at least one more time that year, or you're going to have to finish out that inspection with them, or they can be back on your rotation in another year after that. So, being the best way to have kind of seamless, or at least as painless as possible, inspections with MSHA is to be on a good standing with the inspectors, mutual respect, and, they understand that you're dedicated and invested in the employee safety, and they know that you're going to take those kind of concerns to heart and act on them. If you're in that situation, then if you have a disagreement, you tell them, hey, I'm going to take this up to the field office, or can we call your supervisor? If you're not getting, the relief you need there, just let the field office know that, hey, who do I need to talk to at the district about this, because I still disagree with it. Now, you've made them aware of it. It's just kind of, maybe good practice, I would say, to make sure you don't miss a rung on the ladder. And also just give everyone a heads up that that's what you're going to do. If you are having specific concerns about how the inspector is acting, obviously, that might make the cordial discussion that I just described a little less plausible. Then you just need to know that who's your local field office supervisor, and be prepared to call them on your own. Hopefully, and I would recommend everyone do this, that you've met with your field office supervisor before, and that you've talked to them before, and that you do have some foundation of your relationship, so that when you're calling them to complain about an inspector, they're not saying, well, who is this? I don't know you, I've never met you before, and it's easy for them to side with their inspector. The same goes for district office personnel when you have the opportunity, whether just a phone call to introduce yourself and say hello, or you're going to see them at a conference or a spring thaw or something of that nature. I'd recommend you get to know these people, because they are your enforcement arm, and also these members of management are going to be the people that you're turning to if you have an issue with an inspector on the ground. So, just some tips and best practices on that avenue. We'll just say that, we're coming up to the close of the webinar, so I want to thank you all for joining. I encourage you to look at our blog, where we post a bunch of updates on mine-related and MSHA-related developments. Right now, also, we're posting all of our firm's COVID-19 response materials up on the MSHA Defense Report as well, so you can have those if that's something you're looking for. I welcome you all to join us for the remainder of the 2020 webinars as they come up the rest of the year. We're going to be doing one just about every other month until December, and then we'll go out for publishing and getting ready the 2020 program. As always, I recommend, or request, I should say, that if you guys have a topic that you want to hear about on the webinar program, put it in an email to me, put it in a feedback after the webinar today, and I definitely take those into consideration. So with that, I'll open up to questions. I see that we have a couple questions already in the chat, so I'll give people a few more minutes to send some in, and then we'll start talking about the questions today. But I always recommend or offer that you guys reach out to me directly, and we can talk about anything you want in terms of maybe you didn't feel comfortable asking it today on the chat, or you're listening by phone and you didn't have the opportunity to verbalize it, or you just didn't feel like asking it today. Reach out to me, email or phone, and I'm always happy to have a discussion. So with that, I'll turn to a couple of questions that we still have pending. And then if anyone else wants to ask any questions in the meantime, I'll be looking at the chat. So the first one is a request that, can we clarify the difference between workplace exams and pre-shift inspections from a paperwork stance? And from the paperwork stance, there are two separate records. And typically, I think the person who asked the question kind of saw that as we went through the discussion a bit more, but pre-shift inspections are more specific to mobile equipment, whereas workplace exams are your work areas. Both have to be done before an area where that piece of equipment is put into operation. The other difference is a pre-shift inspection on a piece of mobile equipment. That paper, you don't have the same record keeping requirement that it has to be maintained for 12 months or 1 year from the date that it is recorded. With the pre-shift exam, again, pre-shift inspection on mobile equipment under 56, 57, 14, 100, we are looking there at a record requirement that, we just have to maintain that record until any defect that was found is corrected, and then we have no obligation with MSHA to continue to maintain it. And if no defect was found during the pre-shift examination, we don't have to have a record maintained at any point. I would recommend that we have a record for that day so that there's no question if MSHA shows up that one was done, or even for internal purposes, but we have no obligation with MSHA to maintain that record past the day, past its creation. The other question I think has to do with advance notice, and it's asking about the permissibility of plant-wide emails sharing the day's inspection results. That's not a problem. Because that's not advance notice in terms of you're notifying everyone to tell them what MSHA, or that you think MSHA's on the way, get ready. That's going to be totally permissible because you're looking at, hey, this is what MSHA saw today or issued while they were on site. Obviously, we need to abate these citations, and we want to be sure that we're not having repeats to these situations. There's nothing wrong with that from an advance notice perspective, and that's probably just good practice. So just, to make sure that we're documenting it and doing that creation. Just make sure, though, that if we are creating a record with email, which we would obviously be doing in that situation, that we're, being sure what we put into it is all accurate, especially if it's a description. Also, from the perspective of, now we're bringing a lot more people in, depending on what documents are shared in that. Are we sending around our internal notes, or are we sending around copies of the citation? I think some consideration needs to be given to what is included in that, and it needs to be taken delicately or approached delicately, so that we're not creating an entire network of people with information that might be relevant to future litigation is really the biggest part of that. So, all right, but with that, I think that's all the questions that we have for now. If anyone, again, has any questions that come up, I welcome you to reach out to me. I want to thank everybody who did jump on today for joining us. Stay safe out there with all the current COVID-19 concerns, and I appreciate you joining me today. Have a great day. Thank you.